Get started. Thank you everyone for joining Climate Policy Initiative's webinar on the landscape of climate finance in Africa. The format of today's webinar will be a presentation from Anna Baum and Xavi Meadle, followed by time for questions. If you do have a question, please just submit it via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and then we'll do our best to address it during the Q&A part of the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anna Baum.
Hi everyone. My name is Anna Baum and I'm a project manager at CPI, Climate Policy Initiative. It's a pleasure to be here today and discuss the critical importance of climate finance, both in and for Africa. So for those of you who are new to CPI, we're an analysis and advisory organisation who specialise in finance and policy. On the next slide, you'll see, so we have deep expertise in tracking sustainable investment trends, identifying innovative business models, and supporting solutions that can drive a low carbon, climate resilient economy. On the next slide, you'll see for the past 10 years, CPI has tracked sustainable investment trends globally, regionally, and sectorally. Our latest global report shows annual climate finance flows reached just over $630 billion across 2019 and 2020. It sounds like a big number, but as you're very aware, this is nowhere near what is needed, which has been conservatively estimated at $4.5 to $5 trillion annually through to 2030. So today we're going to focus on climate finance flows in Africa. Whilst critically important, it's also going to be under a spotlight this November as we approach COP27 in Egypt. CPI has undertaken, with support from FSD Africa and CIF, a first of its kind analysis to establish a baseline of public and private climate finance flows in Africa. Throughout this year, we've released several pieces of work which highlight the climate finance needs for the continent, look at what is currently flowing, as well as a framework for innovative solutions to mobilize finance. Finally, we've also done 3 country case studies on Ethiopia and Burkina Faso. Those are forthcoming, but you can see the other publications here on the screen, and we'll find those on our website. Our goal is to improve the understanding of the volume, the sources, the uses, and the allocations of these flows, to identify the entry points, the financing gaps, and the opportunities for new investment. This is aimed to both help investors as well as climate negotiators to scale up climate finance for Africa, where we know this financing gap is going to impact some of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. So to share with you some of the findings, I'll now hand over to my colleague and technical lead for the Africa Landscape Programme, Xavi Meadle.
Thank you, Anna. I'll now share some of the key findings with you from the landscape of climate finance in Africa, where we track climate finance flows for 2019 and 2020, and these are presented as biennial averages. More detailed methodologies and definitions are available in the link that probably we shared with you in the chat box itself. Also, please feel free to drop in your comments in the chat box as we go through the presentation, and me and our team will be happy to respond after the presentation. So during this decisive decade, our analysis estimates that Africa needs around $2.8 trillion or $280 billion per annum to implement its own NDCs and meet the 2030 climate goals. This estimation based on the latest NDC submission of these countries, and its breakdown is also available by country level and by thematic use and also sectors in one of our briefs. And it comes as no surprise that we're falling far short of the needs. Our landscape shows that annual investments of climate finance in Africa stands only at 30 billion. And as such, it required to grow by 9 times at a minimum. In truth, this gap is even likely to be higher. Countries often underestimate their financial needs, especially on adaptation, due to data and methodological issues in costing their NDCs. So yes, time is of essence, and dealing any action will cost the continent more in the future, and these numbers going to increase exponentially. We also found that all African sub-regions receive significantly less climate finance than needed. Investment gaps, of course, vary between regions and different countries. For instance, you'll see Southern Africa, which kind of bears the largest financing gap, and this is mainly attributed to high climate finance needs of Africa, which were alone estimated at 107 billion annually. And this again combines with one of the lowest levels of climate investment that the region also received. And most of these South African countries' needs were estimated in transport sector, so you'll see a lot of less mitigation numbers in there. At country level, if we also did a comparison of countries' GDP as a percentage of climate finance as a percent GDP, in several countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, Seychelles, have investment gaps which ranges above 60% and sometimes even 130% of their GDP, which really implies that more climate finance is needed to be mobilized from external resources, given their low domestic mobilization capabilities. And climate finance is concentrated very specifically in potentially too few countries as well. 10 countries alone absorb more than half the climate finance. And these countries also represent 65% of total climate finance needs. And if you see, none of them are actually LDCs except Mozambique, if I'm correct. While the bottom 20 countries are not shown in the graph here, but where vulnerabilities are extreme, attract only 11% of the track climate finance. Of course, this distribution kind of demands more assessment at country level to kind of better understand the financing gaps and better understand the country-specific opportunities and conditions. So, and this is where the country case study that we've done in Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia kind of comes handy. This is a classic CPI Sankey showing a sort of snapshot for these annual climate finance flows in Africa. So there's a lot of data to overwhelm you, but let me pick some of the few insights for you in this graph or something we're going to break it down for you in the next few slides as well. On the left hand, you see international public finance accounted for a majority of the share in Africa, more than 85%. Interestingly, the pandemic did not prevent international public finance, which kind of increased to 2 billion in 2020 compared to 2019. Of course, I mean, in the coming years, when we track more recent data for 2021 and other years, we'll probably see a much more, maybe an impact of pandemic, but at least for 2019, 2020 numbers, it is what we have. In the center, these sort of blue bands that you see represent public finance, while the orange bands are the private finance, revealing, if you like, the finance mix. And on the right-hand side, we have the instrument breakdown, which we're going to talk about. What we can share with you is that loans were the preferred instrument of climate finance in Africa, followed by grants. Just to give a bit of more color on the public-private split across regions and how they stand against Africa, you'll see that Africa private finance only contributed around 14%, which is sort of a dotted column there. This is significantly lower than all the other regions that we've seen in the global climate finance landscape report. So if you take, for instance, South Asia or East Asia Pacific, it's much higher. It's more than 35% for these regions. And this really highlights the opportunities, right? For the private sector, and it kind of makes it question and things to investigate is how can they be set up for policymakers? How can we have the right regulatory environment and policy decision making to kind of rapidly enhance the private sector investments in the region? For public sources, we also saw that to one of the WRR report that we analyzed, we kind of saw that every dollar that MDB invests, only 29% in co-financing comes from private sources. So how can we kind of leverage these public resources to be used for a maximum effect here? Instrument deployment is a key sort of thing to consider when considering the fiscal space, the capital market depth in these African countries. What we saw was loan-dominated grants by nearly 2-to-1 as a share of total financing, which is sort of the middle pillar that you see here. And also, it's kind of varied, and this is a variation we want to show that it varied across sectors and countries and type of projects and actors that kind of did provide those financing. So if you see multilateral DFI financing is more than 77% through loans. I think that's the purple shade in there. Light purple represents sort of crucial low-cost debt, while grants, the blue shading, which sort of stood at 20%. Financing by international government was mostly in the form of grants. and financing by domestic governments also captured separately from state-owned enterprise and state-owned financial institutions as well. You'll also notice the scarcity of equity finance, and something we can talk about how it can be addressed. Moving on, yeah, this was an interesting finding and a sort of positive trend given Africa's disproportionately high vulnerability to climate change. What we saw was that Africa strikes a much better balance between adaptation and mitigation than a lot of other regions. Globally, financiers only devote 7 to 16% or under 20% of their total climate finance to adaptation. What we saw for Africa was that the share rises to 39%, around 11.5 billion to give you an absolute number. And yet, it's important to know that the volumes remain comparatively low against the needs, and the scale of funding kind of need to be scaled up both for adaptation and mitigation, and they need to increase dramatically and exponentially. Coming to a bit of sector analysis, so according to IEA, Africa needs around $133 billion annually for clean energy goals. And however, what we tracked was annual investment in renewable energy, which is arguably the most commercially viable sector for, from a commercial investor's perspective, stands nearly at 9.4%. And you see the stark contrast, right, on the renewable energy versus the fossil fuel subsidies, which is almost 4 times higher than the climate finance, the renewable energy investments. Whilst not spending all can be green, we agree on all of that. Governments, however, important for governments, to structure taxes and incentives that sort of favor this mainstream low carbon alternatives, ensure that long-term benefits to job creation, energy independence are looked at. And a key starting point would be to track any green and also sort of your low carbon intensive, high carbon intensive investments as well by domestic governments and increase of commitments to make the right policy decisions. And it's definitely a delicate balance, especially in the context of African countries. But yes, policy investments should kind of increasingly be climate aligned. Moving on to the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, AFLU directed only 16% of total climate finance in Africa, though there could be some share of agriculture investments that are going in the cross-sectoral category. I'm going to show you that thing in the next slide. So there may be some direct flows there. But again, it is pretty low. And this is a sort of missed opportunity for agriculture sector, right, which sort of contributes over a third of Africa's GDP. And employing more than 60% of the workforce and accounting for 57% of regions' emissions. So definitely those needs to be scaled up. There are a lot of other sectors that we tracked. I mean, happy to talk those think about in the Q&A. But yeah, I just thought good to share these key sectors with you right now. Also, I think this is something interesting. So cross-sectoral or so-called nexus solutions, which are sort of very critical for economy-wide development in Africa, account for 30% of or 29% of the climate finance flow, so around 8.5 billion. And these are particularly linked to goals, not only just climate goals, but also SDGs, and they are very useful in providing co-benefits like improving a lot of coordination across ministries when they're kind of working on these different projects and also local agencies. What we saw was that 56% of these cross-sectoral flows were targeted towards adaptation projects. 25% was mitigation, and the rest of projects were dual objectives. I would also like to give you a bit of flavor of something else, some other few aspects that we looked at for the effectiveness of climate finance from a gender responsiveness lens, mainly because there was a little better data available on that dimension. 32% of the climate finance that we were able to track for Africa, it had a gender tag available to it, out of which 5.6%. So these are basically the blue and the orange band that you see here. So this much 10 billion, around 9.6 billion, 10 billion, we were able to get a gender tag data, and out of that 5.6 was actually gender responsive. And if you see the breakdown by adaptation, mitigation, dual benefits, you see that adaptation and dual projects offer much more potential for incorporating gender responsiveness. And of course, that sort of varies a bit by different regions in the lower half of the graph. Moving on, we try to look also, I mean, data is definitely very patchy, but we also try to look at the disbursements aspect of these commitments, and what was the disbursement ratio for Africa compared to the rest of the world. Interestingly, it was much higher. Africa, if you see this, it was like the middle one, the climate one that you see here was 79%, which was higher than the rest of the world, which stood at around 65%. Yeah, that's 65%. And while it was similar for mitigation and much higher for adaptation and dual projects objectives. But when you compare it with the overseas official development assistance, the climate disbursement ratio was generally lower across African subregions, probably except for North Africa. And of course, this is something that needs more detailed project level data on disbursements and understanding the profile of projects and how they were dispersed compared to what was committed initially. So yeah, those sort of analysis warrants more discussion and analysis, but this is what we have based on the current data that's available publicly. Yeah, coming on to our analysis, that sort of led this whole analysis and these numbers kind of led us to a lot of key recommendations from which we propose these 6 immediate priorities. We have a lot of we also provide a lot of actor-specific recommendations in the report. So yeah, we really suggest you, highly recommend you to look at those reports. But these are like the 6 broad ones that we came up with. One was adapting strategies to address current future country realities. So as we mentioned, that debt instruments account for more than half the climate finance, right? So this sort of exacerbates already high, debt vulnerabilities that these African countries are reeling under, and compounded by the pandemic and the commodity and food pricing and exchange rate deterioration as well. So any solution needs to be sort of tailored to more local country-specific factors, such as the depth of capital markets or their fiscal space, and also, their ability to implement, so implementation capacity as well. We also saw the second one was concessional finance plays should take on more proactively, take on greater risk, and crucially, once you have de-risk and the projects are operational, move to sort of exit. So stakeholders should come at concessional finance to say energy transition opportunities will deliver sort of just outcomes. Also focus on hard to abate sectors like industry and infrastructure. We do have like a bit patchy data on that, and that requires more data disclosures. I'll come to that as well. Sectors where transition have hardly even begun, like natural capital and carbon sinks, and biodiversity and economic preservation, and also nascent areas like blue economy and probably green fintech as well. Then of course, catalyzing private finance. I think actual and perceived risk and ticket size kind of dissuade private sector capital players, but several steps can be there to expand it, and we kind of cover these barriers that various private sectors, actors, and in one of the innovation brief, and I'm sure my team has shared the link with you by now. We looked at these 4 key sectors: AFLU, transport, energy. The basically mitigation sectors, and kind of did a barrier assessment, like what are the key barriers, technical, project level, governance, and skill level barriers, and kind of did a mapping to the instruments. So I'll recommend you to look at that as well. Yeah, so development partners, just coming back, development partners should sort of target definitely the holy grail of pipelines of investable opportunities. Then also higher leverage ratios to blend financing structures. And I think African countries definitely more focused on private insurance and partial guarantees. And this is where we also think that a lot of domestic and international, like connecting this domestic and financial finance to participation of various international networks like GFANs, to have like country platform approaches are sort of needed. And this is something we have heard in common from a lot of, while we were doing country case studies, we've heard this quite a common issue across all countries. Of course, data tracking disclosures. We do have some pervasive data gaps in the data that we presented to you. There's lack of clarity on tagging of domestic government expenditure. We were able to track some numbers from the publicly available information, but it's not periodic, or it's basically from different standalone reports. There's also imperfect coverage of investments from a lot of private sector investments, especially for several sectors. And also, we do see Chinese investments that are not better tracked in the data, just because we don't know how climate relevant they are. So yes, government and agencies can lead climate tagging and tracking their expenditures. We also need climate information is sort of critical to investors, and therefore private companies also need to kind of produce this sort of information and should be pressed to do so. The next one is stakeholders should kind of support African governments to make smarter climate decisions, develop climate relevant policies. We know like some African countries, they have like relatively robust regulatory framework in place, but many do not have. We have kind of worked at CPR with several governments like Kenya, South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire in supporting these aims and addressing those gaps. But yes, I think all the African governments can also kind of learn from their peers and sort of think about jointly developing best practices and informed regulation. Last but not the least, I think this is an important one as well, that Africa is urbanizing very quickly and cities need to be part of their transformations, right? To play that low carbon transition, important for the low carbon transition. So yet there's some regulations, limits sort of provinces and counties and cities for leveraging these sort of resources effectively. So it's critical that to expand their financial and operational capabilities would also sort of improve vertical integration by avoiding any, policy gaps between what the national action plans look like and what the local initiatives looks like. Yes, and that's that's it. There's some I won't go through into them into details. These are some actor-specific recommendations which are provided in the report. And I think I'll probably stop here now and probably pass on to Anna, if she can just give us a quick view about the interactive dashboard that we've built as part of this report. And it's available to publicly download. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Chavi. And if you stop sharing your screen, I'll pop the dashboard up. So everyone has now access to the link. Let me just share it. Everyone has access to the link to this website in the in the chat box. And if you go through to this page, you'll find all of the publications under the State of Climate Finance in Africa work, including the Landscape of Climate Finance, which Chavi has just run through. If you scroll down, you'll see there's an option to explore the interactive data. And here you will have the interactive data dashboard, which takes you through some of the key findings in this nice interactive and usable format. So I'd urge all of you to have a play around with the data here. And it's particularly useful for those who are looking for data on specific countries. So if I go down to the bottom, you'll find a map of the continent. And here you're able to click on individual countries. And then, for example, if we look at Kenya here, you can see a breakdown of all the data from the Landscape of Climate Finance in Africa, but just for the individual country, in this case, Kenya, which can be really helpful for those of you either investing or working in specific countries or regions. We also have the Sankey diagram, which you saw within Chavi's presentation, the overall Sankey for the whole of the continent. But here you can, again, pick specific countries, and then you'll get a breakdown of who's investing, where that finance is flowing, and in particular, which sectors are receiving the different levels of finance within each of these countries. So I'd urge all of you to play around with the data dashboard, You can also download the source data and also download copies, obviously, of the report. So we have the option to download the source data. So now we will go over to the Q&A. So keep writing questions in the Q&A box, and we will now try and see if we can answer and get back to you.
Great. I can take a few questions that I see right now. There's a question on how, what are the specific reasons why a lot of these financings concentrate in 10 African countries. So, yeah, I mean, there were sort of these different risks. We have to do sort of, and we kind of looked at all these country case studies, which are not part of the, like, these countries were not the highest financing track, but what we can say in general, and based on the innovation brief where we kind of looked at what country-specific barriers are there, we can say there are a lot of perceived, both risk, real and perceived, that kind of reduce investors' appetite to expand investments. Some of the top risks that we see rest of the countries face were regulatory and governance problems. There's currency instability. There's lack of bankable project pipelines. There's also been counterparty risk, which again kind of relates to project level barriers. There's also lack of technical capacity, transparency, and all sort of like information asymmetries that we talked about. So when we spoke to the ministries in one of the countries, that we looked at, they say that there's an investable pipeline that they see, versus when we speak to private investors and they say, oh, we don't see the investable pipeline, etc. So I think it's just not important to kind of build that investable pipeline. It's also kind of showcasing that pipeline also. That was one of the issues that we identified as well. Yeah, I mean, there are more country-specific barriers that you will see in the innovation brief, so we'll share the link with you as well on those ones. Also, some of this also comes down to the capacity in countries to access international climate finance, and that's what we saw with Burkina Faso and a lot of other countries as well. So yeah, so all these top 10 countries that you probably see have probably a relatively better, if I can say so, better capital markets, which are able to attract these large infrastructure projects or large energy sector projects. So yes, it varies. All these countries have very different, contours to it, and what are the barriers for them. So yeah, that's in the question. What was the next question? There's a question also on what more could be done, apart from the multilateral climate funds and MDBs financing. I think one of the crucial link that we also miss is the sub-regional and national DFIs as well, which are sort of important, sort of well positioned to play this catalytic role in this regional integration. They are very well sort of embedded in the local financial systems, working as this sort of conduit between multiple actors, these infrastructure projects, and promoting sort of cross-border exchange of information and finance as well. So we do think they have an important role to play, and they can, and they are the ones who can really amplify their impact by expanding from their role as a traditional financiers to sort of a mobilizer of international climate finance. Also, capacity building in local financial institutions is sort of very important, and this is a regular theme we have heard across all countries. So yeah, they really need to embed climate-friendly expertise, processes, and sort of have these frameworks, not in their just own operations, but also transfer this knowledge to sort of local institutions so that they can also develop that sort of capacity. Definitely, I think on private sector, something that we think was that also look at these opportunities, of using some innovative financing vehicles, like, I mean, green bond probably not so innovative, but green bond insurances and infrastructure investment funds to sort of meet this liquidity and credit requirements of investors, which have these varying risk appetites as well, right? And countries like Kenya and Ethiopia have kind of shown a bit of digital innovation that way. So looking at green fintech innovation, which kind of helps, say for instance, MCOPA, I'll give you an example there. So how you can integrate your climate action with development needs. I think MCOPA was good there, that kind of providing energy access by having solar home systems that consumer can pay through digital or mobile phones, etc. So yes, the use of innovative financing vehicles could be an important one as well. Great. There's a question also, and I would be interested in gender responsive flows. So basically, we took this data from the OECD, where they kind of provide a tagging of whether the project has a gender responsive aspect to it. So it has tagged as principal or significant or not applicable. And also another thing was that CPI does these surveys to over 40, 45 DFIs and gather information on the project level information. But apart from that, this last year, we kind of introduced also understanding the gender responsiveness of those particular projects. So this is the where the data was kind of collected from.
There's been a few questions on the data used and also on the link to the State of Climate Finance in Africa page is the downloadable methodology, which gives you more information and background on both the data used and the process used to analyse that data. But Chavi, could you also answer and provide a bit more detail about how we measured the climate finance needs of African countries?
So these climate finance needs, as I mentioned, was based on the NDCs that countries submitted until February 2022 this year. And what we looked at kind of collated data from their project level, and different countries have very different ways of approaching reporting on their NDC. So it could be project level data on their needs, like giving a detailed list of all projects by thematic areas, by sectors. Also, yeah, so basically we picked their data from that as an aggregation and then kind of try to get them follow basically a needs determination report that UNFCCC came up with. So we kind of use that methodology, kind of balance all those the needs that the country identified between 2020 and 2030 and gave them on the same scale, and that's where we got the needs number from. There's also a question on the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa. So we've not done specific analysis on that, but I think, again, if I show you that graph where we kind of talk about how the renewable energy stands versus the fossil fuel investments, I think that's a striking slide to look at. So we agree that there's definitely any effective energy transition will require sort of this multidisciplinary approach, involving policy support and new financing mechanisms and, business strategies for all the stakeholders that are sort of involved in this value chain. Something that the Just Energy Transition Partnership is actually kind of trying to support, right? Which includes sort of rehabilitation and sort of repurposing of mines and providing support to develop these new economic opportunities on green hydrogen or electric vehicles and a lot of other things. So we do believe that if successful, this donor funded model can be actually even try to be replicated and scaled in other countries as well. I think some CPI is looking at something similar to do in Indonesia, but yeah, that's still under its very primary stage right now.
Thanks, Chavi. We've also got a great question from Edna, which I think others will be interested as well. But what kind of support is needed to improve data tracking and disclosures? We do have this in the recommendations. We have a specific section on data tracking, but I think it'd be great to chat about that a bit now, Chavi, as well.
Yeah, I mean, so definitely, I think one data disclosure data gap, one key data gap that we found was getting climate relevant budget expenditure from the countries. They are sort of domestic budgetary allocations are a very critical source of financing. And, if you kind of do these country level assessments, you probably will see a very different mix of international versus domestic if that data was available publicly. So, I mean, we agree there's no agreed definition or methodology and guidance on what really counted by climate finance at national level. And there's no unified standardized databases that gets us this information from different ministries and, departments, agencies, etc. So that is something we need to really look at country level, is to kind of do these their climate budget tagging of their expenditures. Another key gaps that we have in the database on the private sector investments, and these are related to agriculture and probably transport as well. And that's because there's no standardized methods, which are sort of widely acceptable or accepted by private sector, and also due to lack of internal resources and capacity on even tracking and reporting those, right? So for instance, give adaptation component, which is sort of it's very context dependent, and you're uncertain of the causality of investments that get made. There's lack of impact matrix on those investments, so they do get underreported or not reported at all. And also adaptation sometimes forms a part of the bigger, larger investment, so it's difficult to decipher what part of those is adaptation or climate resilient activities. For African context in particular, was actually Chinese investments in Africa. So we know that there were around, from other sources, that there are 5 billion per annum investments that are being made as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and this spreads across different sectors like energy, metals, construction, transport. We try to look at in these individual data sets and try to look at these projects and try to find information on what is the climate relevance of these investments, right? But yeah, that was to sort of no avail. We were not very confident about including such data in the database. And also, a lot of these climate investment actors that we have, like the Chinese Exim Bank or the CDBs or the state-owned enterprise, which sort of makes it very difficult to track these Chinese investments. Again, so definitely we need sort of more comprehensive analysis or reports to kind of understand the economic, social, environmental impact of these Chinese investments in the region.
Definitely. And then we have another question from Ruby about the climate finance stuff is predominantly directed to the small subset of countries. So we saw that in the top 10 was fragile states see low inflows beyond what is provided by multilateral climate funds and MDBs. What instruments and facilities can be introduced to specifically attract adequate levels of financing to some of these countries seen as high risk? So perhaps, Chami, you can talk a bit there. And I'd also urge you to have a look at the innovation brief, which provides a bit more information and is also segregated down at a country level, and provides a framework for what innovative solutions could be used for specific mitigation sectors at a country level.
Also, there's a question on gas transition and what role that plays for African countries. It is sort of a delicate subject, right, and sort of a demarcate between its potential to offer energy access for these countries and gaps, and also kind of poses the lock-in of high emission infrastructure for the remainder of the years of existence. Our landscape do not capture any of these commitments to gas based on CPR's operational definition of climate finance. But we can give an example from Nigeria case study that we did. It continues to, fossil fuel continues to dominate in the region. We had literally a project which was around 2.7 or 8 billion alone, which is equivalent to the total climate finance that we end up tracking for a year in that region. And it is also supposedly filling these natural gaps between Europe with the war in Ukraine, etc. So yeah, I mean, these are sort of important ones. It's sort of delicate again, I'm kind of mentioning it's sort of a critical juncture, it's development trajectory. Of course, it depends on country context, and these are also faced with multiple, conflicting priorities, mitigation, adaptation, adapting to the inevitable needs, energy poverty, coping with the expenditure, above debt exposure, etc. So yeah, this needs to be seen in a country context, but we definitely agree on transitioning onto low carbon alternatives then. So it definitely depends on country context. There's a question also on how to properly track adaptation finance. This is actually a work something on adaptation and resilience, in fact, and this is something once my colleague, also then the call is kind of in the course of the report, is also kind of working on understanding the what part of it is allocated to adaptation and what is can be the climate resilience of that infrastructure. What is that additional cost? So it has to be at an incremental estimation. So yeah, I think that brief will be published probably hopefully after COP in November. So yeah, we'll be happy to share that link with you. There's also a question on like walk us through how these track investments were and how do you identify climate finance pertinent public sector? How closely do you think these reflect the whole picture? I mean, to answer the first part of the question, we have a operational definition which is based on a lot of other definitions of climate finance, based on MDBs, a common principle of mitigation, and also incorporates elements of OECD methodology as well. So there's a comprehensive methodology in how we track climate investments. But we rely on a lot of DFIs and a lot of other reporting institutions based on what climate finance definition they are following. So just on when we kind of data aggregated, we kind of have to use their operational definition sometimes as well, which is more or less aligned with what we have as our CPI's definition as well. How closely do you think the figures reflect the whole picture? We definitely, like as we highlighted, there are a lot of data gaps in there as well. So we won't be able to give you an exact accurate picture of what the real picture would have been looked like. We know the gap, but we can say even if we underestimating, if you see the need of like increasing by 9 to 10 times, it will be still like something probably in the range of 5 to 6, 7 times or 8 times that required investment needs to increase. So even with underestimation or under tracking, we still think the gap is so large. And what we're talking about is sort of billions in needed in climate finance to kind of address these economies, right? We see 2.8 trillion actually needed, and we're still talking about billions in that space. There's a question on guarantees as well. How do we account for guarantees? So CPI, as a methodology, we acknowledge the importance of these guarantees, insurance, and sort of enabling these increase in private finance flows, especially in sectors which has sort of a low risk appetite for private investment. However, following the principle of conservation, we exclude these instruments from the total climate finance figures because actual disbursements or actual action on these instruments are contingent upon happening of certain events, right? So guarantees in particular are kind of exercised when there's particular circumstances. So there's chance of it never being any financial outflows in the guarantor. So yeah, we don't include them in the climate finance flows as of now, but we do track certain guarantees and instruments, but definitely acknowledge the importance of this. We're asking about doing the plans to doing some analysis in other regions as well. We actually have an Asia landscape, Asia and East landscape that's probably we worked on it this year and it'll be published hopefully soon. It's funded by Asian development banks. So we're kind of going through the vetting process and kind of review process, but should be something that gets published hopefully this year before in November or December.
Yeah, and we're also in the final stages of looking into doing an update to our South Africa landscape next year. So we have other both domestic as well as we'll also be updating the global landscape of climate finance.
Great.
I think we've come to an end of all the questions, so we'll close out the session now. But I want to thank our presenters, Anna and Xavi, for the great presentation, and then to all of our viewers for tuning in today. We hope you found it interesting. The recording will be posted on the CPI website tomorrow in the link that we posted in the chat for future reference. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.